Good morning, Catholic YouTube. Brian with City of the Immaculata. Glad to be with you this morning, all of my fellow peasant friends. So where are we at now? Let's see. We've covered the people of the Middle Ages. Where are we at in this? By that, I mean, where are we at in this series I've been doing on the Middle Ages for the last 6 months or so now? We've covered the people of the Middle Ages, sort of a purview, bird's eye view of what life was like for them, what they were like. We followed that up by debunking some of the myths and misconceptions just of the Middle Ages in general, misconceptions about their scientific knowledge, about their theology, about it being the Dark Ages as it was known for many decades. We've discussed the pious practices, piety of the people of the Middle Ages, the what I coined the good, the bad, and the ugly, to borrow from the great Sergio Leone. We've looked at marriage and gender roles and how did sort of a quick synopsis of that. I guess it's good that I do these series, these lives as a succession of series, because I never really get to cover all that I want to cover in any of them. So there's much more that I want to say of those that we've even done so far that I wanted to add to those lectures. But, after an hour, I think much of what I'm saying begins to not enter a lot of people's brains. And I genuinely, it's not so much the quantity of content that I create as opposed to the quality and how much of this stuff sticks with you guys. I want to give you guys enough info that you can kind of sit with it, reflect on it before moving on to the next thing, as we tend to do so often in modernity. Today, I'm excited because we're going to look at specifically the life of religious, those who would have taken holy orders, what their lives were like in the Middle Ages. And, if you were to ask me, say, Brian, of all of the things that you're interested in medieval history, what would be the top five, 6, 7, whatever? I would probably say that the high medieval papacy has been of much interest to me. Scholastic theology, in particular from the Franciscan tradition. Medieval mysticism has always interested me. The religious orders of the medieval people, in particular the Franciscan, and then just generally how medieval people lived and thought, what their lives were like. And we have spent quite a bit of time on that up to this point, specifically with the laity. And you're also going to find that many of the histories of the church tend to deal with people that are on the higher echelons of society, kings, nobility, knights. And then when it comes to religious, more often than not, bishops, with the occasional, very saintly or very sinful people of the religious life tend to work their way into the story. But by and large, you hear a lot about the bishops more than anyone else. And I don't think many Catholics appreciate just how thorough and complete the reforms of the Council of Trent were. They effectively ended much of what was uniquely medieval for Catholics in multiple ways. Liturgically, yes, it consolidated the Roman Rite as the norm across most of the Western world. It cleaned up many of the abuses that, reform minded men, and by reform minded here, I mean Catholics that had been calling and pushing for reform in the decades leading up to the council, not the schismatic Protestants, right? We're not talking about them here, but reforming Catholics. And I've covered the Council of Trent here. I believe that the council did a lot of good in its reforms. I know theologically there's been a lot of talk back and forth about the Council of Trent, but I think just in its pastoral reforms, it was an underrated aspect of that council. One of the things that it did, the Council of Trent, was that over time it brought a level of respectability to the priesthood that wasn't really a given throughout much of the Middle Ages. It also, at the same time, which is kind of interesting, and we're going to dive into this today, it sort of robbed the medieval priesthood of this almost like mystical feeling that one gets when we see how the medieval people viewed priests. It's an odd thing to wrap your mind around, but really people of that age weren't so concerned with the kind of things that would scandalize us today. It was kind of taken for granted that many people, or excuse me, that many priests may be involved in disreputable activities after hours. In Milan, in fact, the priests had a reputation for being not much better than organized criminals. But none of that affected people's views of the sacraments because medieval people were thoroughly purged of any Donatist tendencies that honestly affects many modern Catholics. The most scandalous priest could still elicit piety and reverence around the Mass and confecting the Eucharist. One of the effects of Trent was that the church so thoroughly cleaned up those type of abuses that the priest himself in his person became much more respectable, and this lasted well into the 20th century. Even if you look at most early 20th century Hollywood portrayals of priests, you take like the Bells of St. Mary or Angels with Dirty Faces, they were all the priests at that time were portrayed as these morally righteous characters. It really wasn't until the abuse scandal that the rug was kind of pulled out for much of the public's perception of the Catholic priesthood. We had run so long up to that point on the reforms of Trent. None of that really mattered so much in the Middle Ages. I mean, certainly there were reform minded people, and the church itself was always looking to clean up the clergy, but most people didn't have the view of secular religious. It was kind of, again, taken for granted to them that to be in the world as what they were known then, it were called the parish priest was known as the secular priests as opposed to the monastic priests. And it was taken for granted that a secular priest by default was having to live in the world, unlike monastics who had varying degrees of withdrawal from the world. The secular religious were very right in the middle of it all of day-to-day human life and all of the temptations and necessities of human life. And medieval people were very commonsensical. The priests would be given to certain temptations, but so long as they were there in that confessional when needed, so long as they were performing the liturgy as needed, giving the laity access to the sacrament, that's really what mattered to most people. I'm getting ahead of myself here, though, because first, I want to go into the Wayback Machine for a minute. And yes, I'm sipping coffee. I got a comment the other day that it was disgusting of me to be sipping coffee during my lives. I don't know what that's all about, but I have to sip my coffee sometimes, guys, because it's early in the morning. So in the Wayback Machine, as you guys are probably aware, there's much debate about the progression of the roles of bishops and the presbyter and the deacons coming out of the apostolic era into the early church. And we could spend an entire hour, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 hours just trying to hash that out. It is clear, I think, at least most historians acknowledge, emphasis on some. It is clear that there was some development occurring to what degree that development is argued. But the role and the importance of the bishop is more clear to us in the early church because, as I said, the bishops were, especially holy bishops in particular, were sort of elevated into the historical narrative, and much of what we have coming down to us are stories of these men. I'm reading right now Gregory of Tours' History of the Franks, and it's a lot. It's quite often about either what the kings of that time are doing, the princes of that time are doing, or what the bishops of that time are doing. So, anyways, the role and importance of the bishop is very clear in the early church. The development of the diaconate in the West is super interesting. It would take us way far afield. But quickly, one thing that we know is that the office of the deacon within the parish became a very, very powerful position. The deacon was often seen more as a representative of the bishop than even a representative of the priest, as we tend to view him today. And eventually, by the 5th century in the West, the role of the deacon started to decline as a permanent state, and it became more of a stepping stone within minor orders on the way to priesthood. And we may cover that at another point. Even the whole thing of minor orders, I'm not going to get into that today, but that was a very important part of the medieval church. Now, as the church expands and grows in numbers, you see more and more the bishops begin delegating sacerdotal tasks to the presbyters, that is, the priests, as it becomes impossible for a bishop to meet the needs of all of the laity, the growing population of laity. Early in the church, it wasn't hard for the faithful to be near and in contact with their bishops. And there's a sense that that is an important feature of the episcopate for the laity to have access to their bishop, as St. Ignatius of Antioch says that where the bishop is, there too is the Catholic Church. And it's important that we be familiar with our bishops, know who they are, have access to them. But as the church begins to grow, it becomes harder and harder. Now, there was a sense in Europe, especially as the church sort of explodes. You have some dioceses in Europe that were literally like the cathedral and a few houses nearby, and that's the entire diocese. Whereas somewhere like here in the United States, which comes much later, that kind of diocese is really unheard of, mostly because the original Catholics that came to the United States were so spread out, they were so few and far between that it wasn't feasible to have these multiple little dioceses. So as a result, we have these massive, expansive dioceses in the United States, which again, this is getting a little too far afield, but if I had my way, I would significantly shrink and partition the diocese if it were the Church of Brian, which it's not, thank goodness. But the idea more and more becomes, okay, the central place is the cathedral, and then sort of as like the hub of the wheel, the spoke spreading out, the the little smaller series of parishes with priests that are in communion, that are assigned by the bishops and that are sitting in his place, are the ones that are day to day administering to the people. And eventually this becomes the feature of medieval Europe, right? The parish priest, again known as the secular clergy, in contrast to religious monastics who may or may not even be priests. All right, so Middle Ages. You're a young man and you're interested in becoming a priest. How would you go about this? Would you go and sign up for the seminary? Well, no, because there was no seminaries. Again, we're so thoroughly entrenched in the post-Tridentine church, where the seminaries are actually a result of the reforms of Trent. Earlier in the Middle Ages, the custom was that you would go and you would apprentice under another parish priest. He would train you in all the rubrics, the administrating life, the preaching, etc. And as you can imagine, the quality of the priest would vary greatly based on a system like this. I am actually a big fan of guild systems, but this guild systems do have to have a little bit more of a standardized methodology to work. This is a little bit more, let's dare I use the word, anarchic at this time, where there wasn't a lot of oversight. You could have a great priest that you apprenticed under, or you could have a not so great priest. Now, as the availability of cathedral schools increased in the higher Middle Ages, and as learned men left these schools and entered monasteries, the opportunity for men to become trained clergy became more a widespread feature, and depending on where you lived, but the hierarchy did see a need for better training during the centuries before the rise of the seminaries. The seminary again doesn't become even a feature of Europe until well after the Council of Trent, in response to the needs of keeping certain suspect ideas out of the ranks of the priesthood, i.e., Martin Luther. That said, the requirements for a secular priest were not huge. He had to be able to speak enough Latin to say the Mass. He had to be able to handle the few sacramental needs that were required. But beyond that, there wasn't really much to separate him from the village at large. Country priests, for example, were usually required to farm, at least farm enough to feed themselves. They often had to take up some kind of supplemental income. They would usually get this from the laity for various services that they offered, like saying a mass or saying a wedding. Now, as you could imagine, having a parish priest who was by necessity very worldly, having to fend for himself in many ways, this lends to certain abuses. It was not uncommon for priests to take up mistresses. It's a little bit beyond just the natural biological reasons. There are certain social reasons why somebody would take up a mistress, because a woman can help out a lot with certain activities. Then of course, there would be illegitimate children coming from this. You would find certain priests that would be found gambling in the dens, trying to make a little extra on the side. Now, as far as wealth goes, though, among the clergy, it gets a bit tricky because generally speaking, all clergy are expected, even in this time, to uphold degrees of poverty. But as you can imagine, if you were the priest in a large city, if you held a certain rank with certain connections, you could end up actually quite wealthy. Though most of the revenue worked its way up towards the top, right, towards the bishops and further on down towards like archbishops and the cardinals in Rome. For most priests, though, especially in the more rural areas, it was a very modest living. You could expect a small stipend from the church, as much as the diocese could afford, but it wasn't always reliable and it wasn't always enough to survive off of. So, as I mentioned, there's numerous ways where your local priest would go about trying to receive. I would say, I'm just loosely going to say money. The money at the time was not just an exchange of silver. There was also various ways in which he could receive chickens, or he could receive payment through certain grain or something like that, right? Just something where he's gaining some form of wealth that he could bargain and trade with, or feed himself off of. A more morally acceptable way would be through the benefices of wealthier lords and nobility, especially if they liked you. You could come to supplement your income with that. So, as a young apprentice, at a certain point, you would present yourself before the bishop and request ordination. And he may have the backing of the parish priest he's trained under. He may just be coming from a wealthy family who wants the perks of a certain parish, usually the land. There's a lot of nepotism and corruption at this time. But ideally, the young man would be able to show that he could correctly say the Mass, and it was kind of off he goes. The bishop would ordain him, and he'd be on the job, hopefully on the job. Though some of these people were there getting appointed by their families, the family would basically tell some of these young men, you're going to be the priest of the family, and the priests may have no interest in doing it whatsoever, or the young man may have no interest in being a priest whatsoever. But usually this would fall upon younger sons who the family didn't necessarily have any other responsibility for, so they would give them this and try to get the perks that would come from being, say, a priest or a bishop over a certain area. One interesting thing is that in the earlier centuries of the church, it wasn't a given that priests were going to wear specific garments to set them apart, which was the sort of a later feature that it's ubiquitous today, especially when we think of the Roman priest or the Orthodox priest, or even certain Protestant preachers. Now don't get me wrong, they always wore vestments at the Mass. This is an ancient custom that goes way back to the early church. But as far as just everyday life, there was no real requirement in the West until the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215. And I actually want to spend a minute with that council because Lateran IV is an extremely important medieval council. It was a reforming council. Among those counted within the era of the Gregorian reforms, that being the process of establishing a priesthood that looks more and more familiar to us, at least on paper. One thing I think we need to keep in mind with these reforming councils is there's a tendency, especially among the critics, to assume that because we find explicit language in the canons, that the assumption of certain critics is that these are therefore innovations. And that's not the reality. How do I want to express this? It's not the reality so much in terms of, okay, there might be certain reforms that would be like, okay, like a seminary is kind of an innovative reform. Though the idea had always been there that priests need to be trained and they need to be able to do certain things. And eventually out of that you get the idea of the seminary, right? So in a sort of seed form, the idea that we need well-trained priests had existed for a long time. How to exactly go about doing that would change over the centuries. So we don't get really the subject of, for example, like priestly celibacy. I don't want to get too deep into it here, but I do want to like draw your attention to the fact that like if you remember that many of these reforms, like at Lateran IV, they are reiterations of things that had been previously held by the Latin Church that the Latin Church didn't necessarily have a way to get a control over, or micromanage, if you will, though that tends to have a little bit of a negative connotation. But you could go way back to some of the earlier Carthage, the Synod of Carthage. What was the other one? Was it Arles? It's one of the earlier councils, not ecumenical, but one of the smaller councils, where they discussed celibacy and incontinence. And though the Latin Church falls far from the ideal at times, the councils, the later councils, aren't innovative. They're reiterations, they're explications, they're announcements that the episcopacy has failed to enforce the rules that have always been there, and that things are about to change, and this is how we're going to go about bringing about these changes through these certain reforms. I hope I'm making sense with that. Now, the success or the failure of these reformed councils is usually in how well the decrees are carried out. But this does have some real ramifications, this particular council, that come down to us to our very own day. For example, it discusses how priests should have to dress in an attire that sets them apart. Again, that doesn't become universal immediately after the council, but the idea is always there that the priests should be a set apart class. So now we're getting into this idea, okay, that the set apart class should actually have something that makes them stand out. Now, the Roman clerical collar wasn't a thing at the time, and the common dress was that the priest would be wearing a cassock. The common thing after the reforms, the cassock would be the ideal garb for a priest to wear, because the idea is that the priest should be set apart from the society, but also so that the people could more clearly see if oh, Father so and so was down at the pub again last night, right, and he was rolling some dice, drinking some beers. So his dress left no doubt whatsoever that it was old Father so and so. Whereas maybe you had a few beers yourself, and if he was dressed like a commoner, you thought maybe that was Father so and so. I don't know. So it's hard to tell. But when he's in his cassock, it's much easier to tell. The council discusses how clerics are to behave in ways that accords with modesty and chastity, and that engaging in certain acts for priesthoods, even if recreational, that the acts could cause scandal, that they could scandalize the laity, and that priests shouldn't be involved in that. Let's see what else comes from that council. There is not even just with the. I mean, I probably should do something just on that council alone at some point. It's where the four precepts of the church are established. It's where the seven sacraments are established. It's a phenomenally important council that was under Innocent III. Now, does this mean that any of these changes, depending on where you live, would you see the effects of these reforms immediately? Well, no, not necessarily. You might not see them at all. You might see them fully. It honestly comes down to whether or not you got a good bishop. Following the decrees of Lateran IV would ensure that a good bishop would ensure that his priests were trained in the Ten Commandments, that they were trained in the seven deadly sins, the seven sacraments, the creeds. They were supposed to be able to preach effectively about teaching the parishioners, teaching them how to approach the sacraments, the lessons of sacred scripture and the gospels. There are other duties such as catechizing children and guiding parishioners in their moral responsibilities. If you had a good bishop after Lateran IV, you felt some of these changes. If not, you didn't. And it really just depended. Another thing that came from this council was trying to make sure that priests had adequate income so that they could focus more on their ecclesial functions. There's actually a wonderful little work by a priest poet from the time named John Merck from the, oh gosh, I guess it would have been a little bit later, like the 15th century, I think, called Instructions for a Parish Priest. And it's a wonderful little work. You can find it online on PDF form, I believe. We don't really have time to get into it, but I really would recommend checking it out because it's a lot of little interesting stuff. It's in Old English, so it's a little bit of a challenge to read, but it's worth the effort. It's kind of the do's and don'ts for a parish priest, including one when I was getting ready for this lecture, I was reading it, and it's on the certain risks that are taken with childbirth in the time, and the instructions for the parish priest was basically to let the midwife do their job, but if there comes to the point where the child is at risk in labor of dying, it is to be the responsibility of the midwife to basically sacrifice the mother to cut the child out so that the priest could be on standby to baptize the dying child. I'm saying cut out. It's early C-section, but again, like the goal is, and this is something that mothers would have to be made aware of at the time, was there was a huge emphasis on trying to be able to make sure that the child was born alive and baptized in time before you were to lose them. So there's a big emphasis placed on being able to do that. There are also various manuals for priests called penitentials to help them in the confessional that are super interesting. These range over a period of time, and it really gives us insight into the kind of things that were to be expected for a priest to hear in the confessional. There's a lot of sexual sins, as you can imagine. The penitentials are pretty hilarious and quite telling, though I tend to wonder sometimes if they express, because there's different penitentials written by different people over periods of time, and I wonder sometimes if they expressed the actual type of things that priests would likely to hear in the confessional based on, actual confessions that are taking place, or if they're based on the kind of things that a priest thinks he's going to hear, and he sort of uses his own imagination to concoct, because some of the things are pretty wild, which I wouldn't be surprised if they were true, because the medieval people were kind of wild themselves. But the penitentials really gives us, because we don't get, I've talked about this before within these talks on the Middle Ages. We don't get a a great insight into the day-to-day lives of medieval people because people just weren't writing about them. So you have to turn to things like records and wills and just certain, like, you have to kind of roundabout try to find out what the life of the peasant was like. And one of the ways that we have tried to establish is turning to these penitentials. But again, I think you have to be like careful with some of that. Some of the things are hilarious. I mean, like what they expect, that what they either expect women are confessing or what women are actually confessing is kind of hilarious. Which is why I think later when you get to men like Saint Alphonsus Liguori, much later. I mean, Saint Alphonsus Liguori is like what, 18th century, and he's writing these moral theological guides, and he's like kind of cutting out some of the nonsense you might expect to find in some of these earlier penitentials. And but he does make, I remember he makes reference to the certain kind of things that you're likely as a priest to hear women confess. But I do want to actually get into the monastics, right? Because I've effectively titled this Life of the Priest and Monastics. Not because I have time to do it any justice, but because the interplay here has effects on us. The interplay between the secular priest and monastics has effects on us up to this very day as Catholics. Just quickly, though, one thing to consider is, what did an AIDS priest do? There was no real retirement system to speak of. And we kind of have scant evidence, but it really appears that it depended on the time and the place. The luckier ones would they would lose their benefices, and they would be given over to certain like yearly pensions subsidized by like maybe a noble or something like that. There is the story of one priest who wrote to Rome to the Pope to implore him not to let the bishop force him into pension because he said he wasn't ready for that. He didn't want to have to live on a standardized income, and that he was still able to perform his duties, whereas the local people of this place were saying that the priest was actually going senile and he was insane and doing some questionable things in the parish. So that one, I found that one kind of funny. We don't know how that one ended. Rome kicked it back up to the bishop, but it is a little glimpse of the sort of interplays that are at stakes in those days before these things would become standardized. But that was the thing, a priest had to consider that. A priest had to consider what he was going to do when he aged out. There wasn't a retirement system really set up for him. All right, so I actually have a series on some of the important aspects of monasticisms in the Western Church, and I plan to do actually much more of that in the future. So you can go and check out. I have one it's a series I did entitled Western Monasticism, and I cover the Benedictines and some of the early reforms of the reforms of the High Middle Ages to the Benedictines, the Augustinians I cover, and then I cover the Dominicans and the Franciscans, though I'm going to cover the Franciscans at greater length in the future. But I want to like quickly discuss here the mendicant preachers in particular, because I've been hinting at it, but I want to be sure that you're able to kind of wrap your mind around the fact that priests, the secular priest in a parish in the Middle Ages, while the Catholic hierarchy expressed a desire that they be trained in preaching, there is no real likelihood that your priest was an effective speaker. In the early days of the office of the bishop, it was designated to him that he be the locus of the preaching office. But as we've stated, as the church grew organically, it became a more common thing that duties would be delegated to parish priests. So when the parish priest is up at the pulpit, if technically he is there in persona of the bishop who can't be there. But there was no real structure to this at this time period, and many priests, possibly at times most, neglected the pulpit. In fact, the pulpit itself grows out of a period where the Dominicans and Franciscans in particular were gaining popularity as speakers. Churches, especially in Italy, began being constructed that were designed to house these large crowds of people that these popular preachers were able to bring in. And originally, the friars would themselves take to like public squares or like pastures, and all of these people would just come, these crowds would gather to hear these friars would stand up on these they would erect these pulpits for them in the wide open marketplace, public square out in the fields. And as the popularity grew, the centrality of the pulpit became more a feature in the churches that were being constructed after the sort of revolution in preaching that took place from mendicant friars. Then, as they moved indoors, like I said, you begin seeing the pulpits inside becoming a feature of the late medieval churches. Because remember, the mendicant friars were created in a large part for a need among the laity for preaching. Dominicans and Franciscans both emphasized for their brothers to go out and preach orthodoxy. And the effective ones, like St. Bernardino, were some of the most famous orators in history. Bernardino would amass thousands of, St. Bernardino of Siena would amass thousands that would come out to hear his sermons, which lasted, mind you, these sermons would last for hours and hours. And oftentimes it would be multiple day sermons that he would be in your town. And they were ultimately so effective that in many ways they kind of led to the undoing of the medieval period. For one, the secular priests were not necessarily happy when a continentally famous speaker came to town, which at the height of this phenomenon was a common feature for a medieval city because it drew men and ultimately consequentially drew wealth away from the parish. tithes and alms instead of going to the needs of the parish. As we stated earlier, many of these guys had come, many of these secular priests had come to rely on these. It was now being funneled into these religious orders of these really effective speakers. And another thing is that the preaching itself, there was a, this kind of adds to this is one of my theories. I'm sure there's other people that have it out there, but one of my theories is that the Mendicant orders, part of their success also sort of led to the undoing of all of this by the time you get to the Reformation. So another aspect of that is that the preaching itself, there was so much emphasis on the holiness of the laity from these mendicants that you begin to see this slow drift towards an almost demystified priesthood. Because remember, the laity for centuries had viewed what the priest did as otherworldly, dare I say, magical, certainly mystical. And then the monastics of the earlier centuries were mostly these men that were cloistered away, leading to their own sort of mystical reputations. But now suddenly you have these mendicant preachers that are saying, no, you too, as in you, the laity, can become holy, and here's how you do it. So it leads to this almost fanatic desire that you see take place in the late medieval period of this desire for preaching, which preaching is a good thing, right? The gospel calls for it. But it's no coincidence that in the coming years, with the advent of the Protestant Reformation, that a huge emphasis was placed on preaching and not on a priesthood. Though many of you tend to think of the long tent revival meetings as a strictly Protestant invention, it has its roots with the mendicant preachers. Now, again, all of the success of these men eventually lead to the unraveling because, for one, they were, and I'm speaking here specifically of the friars themselves, because they were set up, they were constituted on this idea of poverty. But that's hard to maintain when, due to the popularity of your most effective speakers and preachers, excuse me, the people end up wanting to give you all of their money instead of the priest up the road who had maybe been carousing at the pub last night. Monks have always had to deal with the effects of a desire for poverty versus the laity, like, loving that fact about a certain monastic group. Because if you see a holy monastic group over there, that's the group that you want to support. So you end up supporting them, and then the temptation for that group to accumulate wealth and all of the effects that come from that becomes a very strong urge. And monks also always had to deal with sort of conspiracies that grow up around them, like what's going on behind the closed doors of the monastic houses. You often see this come up in, like, critics of monastics, especially by the time you get to the Reformation, but even earlier during the Middle Ages, you see certain criticisms of monastic life. And one of the things that's very common with people that are, this is why I tend to be, some of you out there, some of my, even my fans, loyal listeners of this show, might be more conspiracy minded people. One of the reasons, if you ever notice, I'm a little bit hesitant to accept conspiracies is because historically I know that many of them were born out of the imaginations of people who don't have enough information and they fill in the gaps. So maybe you have a monastic house over there on the hill and you don't know what's going on inside of that monastic house. So rumors begin to spread around it, and that sort of fills the imagination. And then maybe the records of those rumors filter down to us today. And so when people look back on history, they're saying, oh, that monastic house on the hill up there, look at its reputation. But you have to realize, like, a lot of the times it's people filling in information where they don't actually have enough information themselves, because ignorance actually does fuel conspiracy theories. Look, I've been in situations, I'm talking on any grand scale, but on a local scale, I've been involved with sort of behind the scenes dealings in a small town where decisions are, I think I discussed this even on the last live. Like, I've been witness to the mindset of the people that are forming policy and decisions in a small town government. And then once those policies become public, the people who weren't privy to all of the conversations fill in, and they come up with some insane conspiracy theories that just really aren't rooted in anything. But people like they don't have the inside story. They don't, which is why I'm so like I'm getting really far afield here. But like in terms of my political stance on things, I tend towards like keeping policy making out of the hands of the average peasant, the average commoner, because of my experience and how people play these things. But again, this is part of the undoing. You get this like tug of war between the mendicant preachers and the parish priests. The parish priests are effectively always going to have a little bit more day-to-day influence in things because they're just more involved in the like if it's a well-known speaker and he comes to your town, he's a mendicant friar, he comes to your town, he preaches, he's there for a week maybe, and then he's on to the next place. Where the parish priest, he's there and he's a common feature of your life for many years, many decades. And if he doesn't like these friars, well, there's a chance that these people are able to fuel these conspiracies. Now, another challenge for them that sort of lends itself to their unpopularity at the end is that the clergy couldn't be tried by the state. They were at least on as far as canonical law is concerned, they're to be tried by court tribunals of the church, which more and more plays a part in the unpopularity of monks and priests who were answerable only to a hierarchy that was, especially by the late Middle Ages, caught up in its own unruly, unholy secular affairs. So all throughout the like 15th century, for example, you will see like calls for reform, both from the monks and from preachers. Men like Thomas à Kempis, who wrote Imitation of Christ. I mean, if you read that book in its context of when it was written, it's a monastic call to reform. As well among the hierarchy, to clean up their acts so that they could in turn clean up the priesthood. And we would really see none of that actually take place. You see it there's an attempt with Lateran 5 to clean it up. Lateran 5 quite providentially happens right as the Protestant Reformation explodes, but you don't really actually get a cleaned house until the reforms of Trent much later. Let's see what we got here. Thank the Edwardian era frock coat for the modern cassock. Yeah, and we even get the Roman collar was a feature of, I think it's actually the Presbyterians, was the Scottish Presbyterians. So the clerical collar now, which was so ubiquitous and a feature of when we think of actually Roman Catholic priests, is a very modern thing that wouldn't have been a feature, especially of medieval priests. Let's see. I jumped on late and about to start. Blah, blah, blah. It slides right into what I know about the constitutions of the Society of Jesus. Hey, Father John Brown, let me share this one. Yeah, and that's an interesting fact. This would be something to speak to you about. I don't know much about those constitutions of the Society of Jesus, but I would easily imagine that somebody like Ignatius and his early band of followers would have been well aware of the abuses of the monastics and the criticisms and the challenges that what the Jesuits, because the Jesuits wanted to be an effective order that was out there, not sort of, because I mean, this would be so much to get into. I'm going to spend some time in the future on sort of what happened with the monastics, because there's this period where gosh, it's so interesting, from the outset of the Dominicans and the Franciscans, when they come along in the 13th century, the beginning of the 13th century, there's this wonderful period of hope and promise and like the wonderful things that are going to come from these monastic houses and these monastic reforms. Whereas by the end of the 13th century and into the 14th century, when you see the Council of Vienne, they're kind of putting a stop to all of it. Actually, at the Council of Lateran 4, there is a canon which is stating that there's going to be no more new monastics orders formed, right? And so if you see the list, I'm actually putting something together on this right now for a future talk that I'm going to give. But if you see the list of the amount of monastic orders formed in the 13th century versus in the 14th century. It's a huge, huge shift where you have all of these orders formed in the 13th century and then like none in the 14th century because people's perceptions were changing and the attitudes were changing, and it's like, oh, this great hope of what the orders were going to be able to accomplish really turns into this like kind of petty, especially like, God bless them, guys. I love the Franciscans. This is a Franciscan channel, but the Franciscans, very early on, the order itself like fractured into all of these like various different groups, some of which actually ended up, like the spirituales, ended up condemned. So yeah, that would absolutely make sense by the time that you get to Ignatius. Like, this is like, he's got Ignatius, and as he's forming his order, has the hindsight of where some of these other orders, and bravo to him for having the foresight to learn from the mistakes of the past, and maybe that can account for some of the successes that the Jesuits had in the coming centuries, where they learned from the mistakes of some of these other orders. So all right, guys, that's what I got for you today. I hope you enjoyed this one. The next one I've got is going to be a little bit more fun. It's going to be on just medieval mythology, because I just love talking about it, and I love the insanity of the medieval Catholic Church and just some of the things that were out there that we just don't see existing anymore. And the mythologies, there's some great stuff in medieval mythology. So that'll be a few weeks out, guys, but tune in for that one. God bless you all. I will see you next time.